Are you new to mechanics and looking to do a front brake job and not quite sure how? Stay tuned. A lot of people think front brake jobs or rear brake jobs may be easy, and they're really not that difficult. I actually find drum brakes, which is usually on the rear of the cars or the older cars, those are more complicated because you have these little springs and you have to stretch them right and stuff. You'll find drum brakes are a little bit more complicated than disc brake assemblies. So in this video I'm working on a 2000 Nissan Altima, but it doesn't really matter. Yes, there are different braking systems for different cars and they do come apart some different than others, but it's still basically the same idea. GMs, especially the older GMs, use an Allen head bolt that goes into the caliper bolt that holds the actual caliper on, and then most of your imports are anywhere from 12 to 14 millimeter bolts, and some of them, like Mazda braking systems and I think even some Toyotas, only have one bolt. The caliper slides on one pin and it bolts with the other one. And I'm going to try to find some different pictures to put in this video to show you the different type of braking systems there are. But the whole idea of this is to give you just to give you a gist of how to do front brakes. Actually, I never really thought about it until my stepbrother called me and said, "Hey, I'm tearing this brake system down and I'm not really sure, how to do it." And actually, his biggest concern was the little screws that hold the rotor on. So we'll talk about that. But in this video, I wanted to explain basically what to look for, how it comes apart. I didn't go over some things in the video as far as like looking for brake fluid leakage, like around your brake hose and stuff, looking for cracks on your brake line, because especially, well, I was going to say fronts, but most all braking systems on cars now have rubber lines that run to each wheel, so you want to look for cracks, especially when it has 100,000 or more, or if it's got low miles but a lot of years. If you're looking at a car that's 10 years old, you need to start looking at the brake lines to make sure they don't have weathered cracks or coming apart. Another myth I want to bust right now is, because I did another video on I think a Mazda front brake job, and I let the caliper hang by the brake line. Well, the caliper was made of aluminum and doesn't weigh anything, and what people don't seem to realize is if the weight of the caliper can pull the brake hose apart, then you've got problems when you're cramming the brakes on, because you're putting 1,000 psi or more on that brake line hose when you're stepping on that brake pedal, as opposed to 8 pounds on a caliper. Aluminum caliper usually weighs about 2 pounds. So you don't want to drop, just let it drop and yank on the hose. But and two, if the hose is brittle or old with age, you don't want to be hanging it. And they do make caliper holders, little hangers. I've often used to use mechanics wire or tie straps just to tie them up to the, like on front wheel drive cars, you can tie them to the strut or to one of the suspension pieces to keep it out of the way. I've seen some videos, and I'll show a demonstration here in this video, of where one guy shows how it's a slick idea, but he takes one caliper bolt off and takes the other one just loose, and he flips the caliper up so that he can get to the brake pads, and that's okay. That's not a bad idea. But if you're going to have to change the rotor, which in his video he did, if you're going to change the rotor, the caliper bolts to the caliper bracket, which it goes behind, and you can't get the rotor off without removing the caliper bracket. So you wouldn't want the caliper bracket weight or all that mess tied with the caliper and trying to hang it up, to protect the brake line and stuff. So it's best to just remove the caliper. Plus you want to inspect it as well. So flipping it up, yes, that's a slick and cool idea if you're on a speedy thing, but if you're doing a brake job, you want to inspect things while you're there. You don't want to have any problems down the road and find out when you hit the brake pedal that you don't have any way of stopping. So let's dive into the video, and then I'm going to annotate and put a few things here and there in it, and we'll go from there. It doesn't really matter which kind of car. This is a 2000 Altima, but in general, and this is more applied to imports, although domestic cars are using pretty much the same style brake designs. But As you can see, it's just a front rotor, it's a caliper, and let's identify it. This is the rotor, this is the caliper, this is the brake pad retaining bracket that actually holds the brake pads. This just actually squeezes them. And always look for the bolts. Okay, these are the caliper bolts. And this right here, which looks like a little accordion boot, that's what they call the slide. That allows the caliper to actually go back and forth and just adjust itself on the rotor. This one has two. Some Mazdas and some Hondas, I think, both use just one bolt, and then the bottom one is a slide, so the caliper will slide on and then pivot forward, and then you put the bolt in. So what we're going to do is take these bolts loose. I've already broke them free, so I'm going to take the bolts out. If you got you an air ratchet, you know, or an electric one, you can use that. I wouldn't suggest putting it back together with it. I'd always hand tighten these bolts because you don't want to break them off. Now what I'll do is I'll grab hold of the back of the caliper and I'll just kind of pull it towards me. And what that does is that compresses, I don't know if you can see it, but that's the piston right there that comes out of the caliper. That is kind of compress it and allows it to be able to slide free. So you can just wiggle it, and I'll do this one with one hand. Everybody has a conflict on this. If the caliper is a real lightweight aluminum like this one is, you can let it hang by the brake hose. It's not going to hurt it because you've got points that actually hold it. These things are crimped if it can't stay together from hanging just from that light weight. But just for safety, just in case you don't know the weight or the limits to it, just set your caliper up on top of the rotor, or you can use it to pin. Of course, I'm going to have to move this because I'm going to be pulling this rotor off. I'm not sure if you can see it in the camera angle, but it's been worn out. And what's happened here is I did a brake job on this car not too long back, and I bought, I won't say what part store, but I bought their house brand ceramic pads, and this wheel just been dusting all the crazy, and it roars and stuff. The other side is perfect. Of course, I replaced the pads anyways, but these pads have just disintegrated on this side. Now what you look for is, first off, especially if your outer pad is wearing out, look for your slides. And see these slides? It slides easy with my fingers. So that tells me that that it's not sticking, because that's what happens when they get stuck. It keeps pressure on the outer pad, and it'll eat the pad up, and it'll do like what it did here in the rotor. The other possibility is the piston sticking in the caliper, or you have a bad hose that is getting to where it lets fluid out when you push the brake pedal, but it kind of works as a one-way valve and keeps the fluid from going back and holding pressure onto the piston. But I don't think that's the case here. Anyways, I'll get a tripod stand here and hold this camera, and I'll show you how to compress the piston and the caliper and what to look for. Okay, this is a caliper tool that it's designed to push the caliper back in. Notice the knob is small. Now you can use a C-clamp, but usually a C-clamp has a lever that's that long. This is a good thing, it's a bad thing. Yeah, you can get torque on it and stuff, but there's a reason why they make this thing so small. If it takes more than what you can get your hand on this little knob and push in, your piston's not going in and out right, and it could be causing brake failure. But if you can sit there and turn this thing without a whole lot of force, that means the piston's free. Okay, I'll just place a pad in that position. Kind of centered up. I mean, you can get it kind of cocked if you don't have it going in the center, but just kind of eyeball center it. And now, see, it's not taking any kind of force to push that piston in. So that tells me my piston is free inside that caliper. Of course, you always want to look around the caliper to make sure that it's not wet, because if it's wet, it means you've got a seal leaking. So always look for wet spots around your hydraulics. And like I said, you can get this tool pretty much any auto parts store, rent it. I think the tool's 15-20 bucks new, or you can rent it probably the same price and get your money back. But it doesn't take any effort. Like I said, you can hear me talking and I'm not grunting. It's just real easy. And just do it until you can't turn it. Now it's bottomed out. Now I can't turn it. And that's all it takes to squish a caliper piston back in. On another note, if you say your car has quite a bit of miles, so you get 50-60,000 miles on it and you're changing your brakes out, get a hardware kit, which I already have. This stuff, of course, is dirty, but because this side's been dusting. But I already bought new pins and the little bushings that go with it, and these little boots. All this is new, and these little plates right here that kind of just, all they do is just kind of spring load and hold the pad in place. They can cause problems if they're not properly installed or if they've gotten bent somehow or other, but these are still new. So if you're going to do a brake job, do it right. Get your hardware kit, replace these retaining plates here, and replace your slides, or at least get the boot kits and the bushings. And when you get done, make sure you grease it real well and make sure they move. Like I said, make sure they move. Get this in, make sure they move in and out. That boot's kind of loose when it's real easy to put back on, see. And just make sure they slide in and out. If they're sliding and they're not sticking, like these aren't, then you're good. But if they have any kind of resistance to them, you want to clean them up, put bushings, and grease them. I'm going to take the rotor off. Now, as you see, the brake pad, let me get this thing unzoomed. The brake pad carrier, or the brake pad bracket, that actually holds the brake pads in place, it's lipped over the rotor, so obviously you can't take the rotor off. So you come back here and you'll see the two big bolts. I can't really tell you what size is going to be on every car. This one happens to be 19 millimeters. They're normally fairly big. They'll run from 17 to 21s usually. Unless you're working on an older car, but older cars really don't normally have this type of braking system. But anyhow, take these two bolts loose, and then we'll take this bracket off. And just set it off like that. If you're just worried about getting it wrong, just set it down the way you found it. Pull your rotor off. To point out, some rotors, these are threaded so that if the rotor is stuck right here, or they get rusted on the hub, you can put a bolt. You'll have to figure out which size thread it is, but you put a bolt on each side, and as it screws in, it'll push and pop it. So it's kind of like a self-made puller. Some Mazdas and some Hondas have, and some Toyotas actually, have a beveled screw, sometimes two, that hold it to the rotor. That way to the hub assembly. That way the rotor's tight fitting, which is kind of nice when you go to put the pads, because when the rotors flop around, sometimes it's hard to get the pads to set in right. But usually after so many miles, they become heat fused and rusted fused, and you have to use what they call an impact driver. It's like a device that you put a screw bit in and hit on the end with the hammer, and it pushes in and turns to knock it free. Of course, I'd always recommend using a little brake or liquid wrench, some lubricating oil on it first before you start beating on it, because otherwise if you break them off or mess them up, then you're going to have to drill them out. But that's something you could be in for, depending on what kind of car you have. And like I said, most all of them have threaded holes here to use for a puller. New rotors always come with either some type of a coating they've sprayed on it or oil. So always use some brake cleaner and wipe both sides of that off. I mean, It'll work and it'll burn off, but I wouldn't recommend it. So clean them up with some brake cleaner and put the new rotor on. As simple as sliding it on. If you find your brake hub this rusty or this dirty, you want to wire brush it really good. You can use a wire wheel or just a hand brush, but you want to get in maybe sandpaper as well. And if your hub seems to be a consistent, every time you pulled it apart it always seems to be rusty, it might be a good idea to actually smear some anti-seize on the back of it. Ensure that your rotors are identical. Set them aside and make sure they do line up and everything looks right. You may want to consider painting your rotor as well. And like in this picture here, where it's painted black around the hub area, and you can't hardly tell it, but the fins on the outside have also been painted. You could paint the back side, but I would not recommend painting it where it sets against the hub. It's always better for the lug nut Torx specs to be accurate and to not loosen up if you don't paint the back side. The paint can flake and crush, so don't paint the back side, but do paint the front. If you're worried about rust on the back side, use anti-seize. You will want to use caliper paint. Any other type of paint, even engine paint, it won't resist the heat that the rotor gets when you put the brakes on. So caliper paint. And I mean, while you're at it, you could go ahead and paint your caliper as well if you really want to look real nice, especially if you have open wheels. But like I said in this picture here, it's been painted. They don't come painted like that. You might be able to buy them somewhere painted like that, but in this case here, if you want it painted to make it look nice and to help resist the rust, use caliper paint. Sadly, today rotors are made already to the point of being replaced. They make them just thick enough to last. They've already got calculated how long it's going to take before they wear, using new pads. In the old days when they were finned rotors, pretty much on heavier duty cars and stuff, you could turn them several times before you reach what they call minimum thickness. Minimum thickness is throwaway. When it gets to the minimum thickness, then you toss them. Today's rotors, especially the front wheel drive, lighter weight cars, they're solid rotors, which means it's a lightweight type braking system. If it's got a finned rotor, it means it's a heavier duty, or the fins actually create air cooling and for higher heat. But no matter, even the heavier duty rotors now are made to where you don't have a whole lot. It's a marketing thing basically. They don't want to make it thick enough to where you can take it and get it turned. They want you to buy more rotors. So to ensure that just to make sure when you're doing a brake job, my rule of thumb is if you're going to do a brake job, just go and replace the rotors, because I know these things wear out. However, if you're not really sure, it doesn't hurt to go, if you don't have a micrometer, you can go rent one and measure the thickness of the rotor and see if it's how close it is to minimum thickness. Because if it's right on the minimum thickness, you've got to realize once you start putting brakes on, you put your brand new pads on, you go down the road and you start driving, and you put 40,000 miles on it, it's going to be below the spec. What happens when it's below the spec is when you go to hit the brakes and it gets hot, and let's say you hit a puddle of water, the rotor will warp very quickly. It could warp just sitting there cooling off. When they get so thin, they no longer can retain the exact shape that they're in, so they get warped, either like a washboard wave across the rotor, or the rotor actually becomes twisted. So it gives you a pulsing effect in the brake pedal, and makes your steering wheel kind of go right to left when you put the brakes on. And that's another indication of when you have a bad rotor, is when it pulses back and forth. So I would recommend always measuring the rotor. If you're on a budget, you're trying to save some money and you're not sure, at least measure the rotor. But if you look at the rotor and you've got a ridge at the top, in other words, you can see where like the pads have been digging into the side, I can already tell you the rotor's gone. So in my opinion, if you're planning on doing a front brake job, especially for a car that's got 80 to 100,000 miles on it, buy new rotors. They're cheap now, because they know that you replace them quite often. Now if you got the little screws like I was talking about, then you can push it up there and put the screw in and it'll hold it nice and firm in place, which is really nice. Another option you can do is if you don't want it flopping around, take you a lug nut. And just do it by hand, and then that way it's held pretty fair in place, things won't flop around. Then you can just set your pad retainer back in place.
As a tip, clean your threads and use some blue thread locker. Blue is temp, red is permanent. This helps ensure that your bolts don't back out.
I'll tighten up the bolts and then we'll set the pads in place. Okay, I've tightened those two retaining bracket bolts down. If you're curious how tight they go, probably 120 foot-pounds. You can look the specs up. It's going to be hard for me to show you with the camera how they kind of feed these. And you'll see that little notch right there. It sticks in the little bitty cutout notch there. I don't try to put it all the way in. I usually try to go on the outside and just wiggle it, and then it pops in. Now usually on the outer bank you have to kind of slide in many different angles to get it started. And I have sprayed an anti-squeal compound. That's why it's sticky. That kind of helps it keep from squealing. Because brakes will do that even when there's just nothing wrong with them. Now I've compressed my piston on your. A lot of these pins are flat on one side or both sides, and that's to kind of hold it in place because the threads are there. So you need something to hold it in place. So you kind of make sure those are lined up when you go to slide your caliper on. All right, you see this rubber boot right here. Then this little piece right here is a piece of metal. See, it's flat on that side and it's flat on the bottom. And that sits up against a piece of metal on the caliper, so that allows this piece not to turn when you're tightening this bolt or untightening, either one. That is a stop, so this can thread into it. That way you don't have to try to figure out how to hold a wrench to it or anything like that. So that's what that flat spot is, and that's what you want to make sure you match up. If you have that flat spot over here, the rounded part is going to hit that piece of metal and keep it from going all the way flush to this. So just be careful when you put this part together. That way it'll assemble back correctly. Kind of have to squeeze these in a little bit. Like I said, if they were sticking, I wouldn't have been able to do that so easy. Just wiggle around until you get it thread started. Be helpful if you don't do that. There we go. I'll tighten them up. Then before you start rolling the car, be sure to push the brake pedal in until you get a pedal, because when you've compressed those pistons back, you've got to push the brake pedal to get the calipers to set, to be ready to brake. I've actually seen somebody do a brake job real quick and got in a hurry, compressed the pistons, slapped the car together, throw it in reverse, and ran out in traffic because he didn't have a brake and he couldn't get a brake pedal fast enough before he went out in traffic. So be sure when you get the wheels back on stuff, go in there and pump the brake until you get a brake pedal. And don't worry, you don't have to worry about bleeding or anything, because you've not opened it up to the air, so there's no reason to bleed the brakes. There, you've kept everything retained inside. And really, you shouldn't have to add any brake fluid. Unless you've got a leak, there should be no reason to add brake fluid, because when we've compressed those pistons, we've pushed the brake fluid level back up into the master cylinder. So tighten these bolts down, put the wheels on, pump the brakes, and then we should be ready for a road test. And that's all there is to doing a simple front disc brake job. So in this video, I hope that you learned a little something about doing brakes. Like I said, this is on front brakes, but it's the same method, same process on the rear brakes. I mean, the only difference is your rear wheels don't turn. The nice thing on the fronts is you can turn the wheels and get to the caliper bolts easier, but it's really no difference as far as front and rear disc brakes. Now drum brakes, and at some point I'm going to go in and get a video on doing drum brakes, but because that is more complicated. But if you've got disc brakes on the front and the rear, this is the same process and same method, so it should help you. But if you did like the video, please like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please leave comments. I always usually answer back within the next day. I also put my website address down in the description, so you can contact me there, and I don't charge for that. If you have pictures or something you want to send me or something to look at, I'm more than happy to help. So stay tuned for the next video, because I'm always working on something goofy. See you in the next one.